price pressures are continuing to ease.
U.S. inflation has fallen to a 3-year low, meeting pre-pandemic levels.
2.4%, the lowest rate since February of 2021.
So inflation is now lower, which is kind of weird because I swear we were told that hyperinflation was coming. Across most of the major economies around the world, inflation is now at a relatively acceptable rate after peaking in 2022. Central banks, governments, and Team Transitory are all relieved to see this happen, but for many individuals, this doesn't mean much. A lot of goods, including groceries, utilities, and insurance services, are all still much higher than they were before 2020. And people are struggling.
If you're struggling to pay the bills, you're not alone. New research revealing the cost of living is hitting harder than ever before.
This is because the inflation rate we see is a measure of change. Specifically, it measures how prices have changed from the same period 12 months ago. So when inflation decreases, prices are still going up, just at a slower pace. As we can see here, prices of goods and services remain at elevated highs, causing the persistent cost of living issues around the world. It's hard to argue that these issues weren't in some way caused by COVID. If we conducted a really unscientific estimation and drew a hypothetical line of what prices would be if COVID never happened, there's a sizable gap between the prices. This raises an interesting question. Could the current cost of living crisis that is being felt by millions of people around the world be solved if prices fell to what they would have been if COVID never happened? At first glance, this sounds like it solves everything. If the prices of all goods and services fell, people should be able to buy more of what they need, which eases cost of living pressures. And it sounds like something that should happen as well. We know that one reason for the recent high inflation was due to supply shocks from COVID and the Russia-Ukraine war. And we also know that after temporary supply shocks get fixed, the prices of the affected goods tend to fall back down to what they were before. Here's the price of eggs when there was a strain of bird flu killing chickens all over the US. And here's the price of eggs after the flu disappeared. So if it can happen to one type of good, can it happen to the broader economy? Probably not. For two main reasons. The first reason is that supply shocks weren't the only factor that caused the high inflation that we've been seeing the past few years. It's still too early to confirm the impact of all the causes, but fiscal and monetary stimulus during COVID and price gouging have also been identified as other factors that could have caused the surge in inflation. And secondly, and this is arguably more important, the cause of inflation doesn't really matter. Governments don't want the price levels going down. Across many developed and developing countries, economies have positive inflation targets. This is because inflation, especially when it's low and stable, can help boost an economy. Consumers are encouraged to spend to avoid paying a higher price in a later period. Businesses are encouraged to invest to stop the value of the capital from eroding over time. And borrowing is encouraged as future loan repayments are paid back with less valuable money. All this money moving around the economy drives wages up and creates a positive feedback loop which encourages more economic growth. A low and stable inflation rate, say around 2%, provides a steady and predictable environment for all participants to take part in. Which is all to say, prices are unlikely to fall anytime soon. But should they? Like, governments make stupid decisions all the time. What if a decrease in the price level could also be good for the economy? What if it could solve the cost of living crisis? A consistent decrease in prices is called deflation, and economists hate deflation, probably more than they like inflation. Just like how inflation encourages more economic growth, deflation encourages less economic growth. Consumers are encouraged not to spend in order to pay a lower price in a later period. Businesses are encouraged not to invest as they'll earn a higher return leaving the capital alone. And borrowing is discouraged as future loan repayments are paid back with more valuable money. Most importantly for the people struggling with cost of living, this slowdown in the economy means their wages will fall as well, potentially leaving them in a worse place than they were before prices fell. And that's why governments and central banks don't like deflation. But hey, you might think, I already know this. I too watched that Vox video with way better animations than this video, and I also watched that AI word-for-word copy of that Vox video. But that's not the full story. Here's something that you might not be aware of. Deflation potentially has the possibility of, could, depending on the right circumstances, be a good thing. Let me explain. First, it's important to recognize that deflation, or even inflation for that matter, rarely starts out as a cause and is more often a symptom of what's going on in an economy. Here's the basic aggregate supply and demand curves of an economy. The curves intersect at the equilibrium output and price level. We'll start by graphing out the two ways inflation occurs. If there's a boom in the economy, the demand curve shifts to the right, which leads to the equilibrium output and price level both increasing. This type of inflation is called demand pull inflation. The second way is if there's a leftward shift of the supply curve. Say the cost of inputs like oil or labor rises. This is called cost push inflation. In this scenario, output falls and the price level rises. Low levels of production along with high inflation is why this is sometimes referred to as stagflation. Moving on to deflation, the deflation that economists and governments are all worried about is when there's a leftward shift of the demand curve, which is what happens when there's economic downturns like recessions. The main concern is that reduced consumer and business confidence will reduce consumer and business confidence even more, driving prices and output even lower until, theoretically, nothing gets produced and everyone suffers. This is the bad type of deflation. On the flip side, the good type of deflation is if the supply curve shifts outwards, along with lower prices, there's also an increase in output. But, like I mentioned before, it's important to recognize what caused the supply curve to shift right. If it was for temporary reasons, like if the price of oil is lower for 6 months, this outward shift is also temporary, and the supply curve will just shift back to its original place. However, a rightward shift caused by a permanent increase in productivity levels or efficiency gains will cause the supply curve to permanently stay shifted. This is what happened between 1870 and 1890, where the transition from agriculture to industrialization created increases in productivity and increased real wages and disposable incomes. If we looked at a specific type of good, this is why some modern electronics are so cheap compared to when they were first produced. We're just much better at making them now. So supply-driven deflation sounds like a good thing. Why aren't policymakers pursuing this instead of a 2% inflation rate? Well, the truth is, they kind of are. The most important part of the supply-driven deflation is that it's led by productivity, which then leads to increases in real wages, which are wages that are adjusted for inflation. Increasing real wages is really what matters for a more affordable economy, and governments keep a close eye on real wages. At the end of the day, the numbers we see in our payslips and in grocery stores don't really matter. If you have $12 and a can of Coke costs $3, you can buy 4 cans of Coke. If you have $120 and a can of Coke costs $30, you can still only buy 4 cans of Coke. The numbers don't matter, you're equally as rich in both scenarios. So if you have $20 and a can of Coke costs $4, it doesn't matter that you have less money than in the second example, and it also doesn't matter that the can of Coke costs more than it did in the first example. You can now buy 5 cans of Coke, which means your real income has increased and you're better off. So as long as real incomes are rising, there's no need for governments to want the prices to fall. And despite what you might have heard online, in many countries they have been. If you ignore that generalish period where governments were just handing out money to workers and low-income people were losing their jobs, real wages are about as high as they've ever been, even after falling during the post-COVID recovery. Except for Australia. Wow, thanks for ruining the narrative. I mean, at least real wages are starting to pick up again. That is something, I guess. Alright, maybe I'll replace Australia with Canada actually. Yep, that looks way better. Great. Real incomes across many countries have risen back to pre-COVID-ish levels, meaning that it's not necessary for prices to fall. And if you're someone that's genuinely struggling to afford everyday essentials, or if you're someone from Australia, this probably sounds like some premium level gaslighting. Averages don't necessarily represent all of us, and this is especially true for low-income people. Unfortunately, there's no real easy fix. In the long run, real wages do tend to go up. But in the long run, we're also all dead. So it's up to governments to implement policies to help people that are most affected by the cost of living pressures. Oh, never mind. I mean, you could start like an OnlyFans or something. Yeah, I don't know. Thanks for watching the video. Check out this video as well, and please subscribe. Thank you. Goodbye.